On September the 26th, 1933, in Memphis, Tennessee, federal agents surrounded a small house at 1408 Rayner Street just before dawn. Inside, one of America's most wanted men was still in bed. George Kelly Barnes, known to the headlines as Machine Gun Kelly, had been on the run for weeks. But this morning, there was no shootouts and no getaway. The front door crashed open, agents stormed the hallway, and from the bedroom came a panicked voice. "Don't shoot, G-men, don't shoot." Machine Gun Kelly, the most feared man in America, or so they said, was cowering in his pajamas, hands in the air, begging for mercy.
So how could this man, who, according to the press, have killed hundreds of men, kidnapped countless more from their own homes, and robbed nearly every bank in the Midwest, now be cowering in the corner, not going down in a blaze of fury, like predicted?
The agents were stunned, not by the surrender, but by how easily it had happened. There was no blazing Tommy gun, no last stand, just a scared man who was wrapped in a myth too big for him to control. That moment would go down in legend. The newspapers would eat it up. Hollywood would borrow the line, and the FBI, they couldn't have scripted it better.
The FBI never sleeps. The G-men have become a legend.
The message was clear. No one, not even the infamous Machine Gun Kelly, could stand against J. Edgar Hoover's Bureau of Investigation.
But who really was the man behind that name? A man who, apparently, could sign his own name with a Tommy gun and shoot an acorn off a fence post from 30 meters away. Was he really the ruthless outlaw that the headlines warned about? Or was he just simply a petty bootlegger, inflated by media hype and J. Edgar Hoover's PR machine to expand the power of his embryonic FBI? This is the story of Machine Gun Kelly, the most feared man in America.
George Kelly Barnes was born on the 18th of July 1900 in Chicago, Illinois. Unlike many of the Depression-era outlaws who came from poverty and neglect, Barnes was raised in comfort. His family was upper middle class, and he would become one of the few high-profile criminals of his time who could say that he went to college. When George was just 2 years old, the Barnes family relocated to Memphis, Tennessee. He grew to love his mother, Elizabeth Kelly Barnes, and at the same time, he felt a quiet resentment towards his father, who worked as an executive at an insurance company. That resentment would soon harden into outright hatred. In 1914, a teenage George witnessed something that would shape his view of his father forever. He followed the man to the home of a woman who wasn't his mother, an affair unfolding in plain sight. His initial instinct was to run home and tell his mother, but instead, George calculated an opportunity. The next day, he skipped school and marched into his father's office. He calmly confronted him and stated his demands: a higher weekly allowance and full access to the family car. His father, caught off guard, accepted instantly. With the family car available and Tennessee under state-level prohibition since 1909, George spotted another opportunity. While still a student at Central High School in Memphis, he dabbled in bootlegging, making liquor deliveries under the radar. It wasn't long before the law caught up with him. During his sophomore year, he was arrested for alcohol possession. Knowing the kind of sway that his father held in Memphis, George placed a confident call for help, and once again, his father came through.
But not long after, tragedy struck. His beloved mother, Elizabeth, died before he could graduate. George blamed his father's infidelity for breaking her heart, and in turn, breaking the family. Over time, his anger hardened into bitterness, and their already strained relationship became toxic.
After finishing high school, George went to Mississippi A&M College, now Mississippi State University, to study agriculture. He did this to meet his mother's hopes rather than his own, but his time there was short-lived. Within just a few months, he racked up 31 demerits in his first semester and 24 more in the early weeks of the second. His best grade was a C+ in physical hygiene. He failed outright in woodwork and didn't even complete military science. At one point, he even climbed the school's flagpole to fix a pulley just to erase some of his demerits. If anything, he was becoming more of a spectacle than a student. His college career came to an abrupt end, and George headed back to Memphis with no clear direction, just charm, ambition, and a hunger for something greater. At a social function, he met Geneva Ramsey, the daughter of a prominent local businessman, George F. Ramsey. George was immediately besotted with her. Geneva's father, however, had heard whispers about the boy's growing reputation and forbade his daughter from seeing him, but George was relentless. One night, whilst driving through Mississippi, George persuaded Geneva to marry him. Geneva accepted, and after several days of celebrating, the newlyweds returned to face the Ramsey family. Surprisingly, Geneva's father extended an olive branch. Even with his concerns, he offered George a position in the family business, railroad construction in the Mississippi River Valley. Over time, the two men developed a mutual respect. For the first time in his life, George had a true father figure, and he thrived under Ramsey's guidance. Years later, while serving time in Alcatraz, George reflected on this period of his life. If Ramsey had been my father, my life would have been entirely different. Tragedy struck again in the mid-1920s when Ramsey died in a dynamite accident. The loss devastated both George and Geneva. With her husband and business partner gone, Geneva's mother, Mrs. Ramsey, sold off the company and tried to help her daughter and son-in-law start fresh. George bounced between ventures, a used car business, a goat farm, and eventually a brief stint in insurance, aided by his estranged father, but nothing stuck. Geneva, now the mother of a young son named George Jr., known as Sonny, watched in horror as her husband spiraled. Bootlegging returned, and he developed a nasty drinking habit. Next, the violence followed. During a heated argument, George hurled little Sonny across the room. From that day forward, Sonny feared and resented his father. The damage was irreparable. George continued to flounder. He drifted between jobs, and as his drinking worsened, so did his behaviour. Friends and family started to view him as not only unreliable, but also as lazy. He seemed unwilling to commit to anything that didn't provide quick rewards. Geneva left him several times, but she always returned, until the day that she didn't.
She suffered a miscarriage during one of their many separations, but later she gave birth to their second son, Bruce. George adored Bruce, showering him with attention while openly favouring him over Sonny. The emotional divide between the children mirrored the one between husband and wife, and eventually Geneva left him, and now George was truly alone. George's life had hit rock bottom. His marriage had crumbled, his alcoholism was out of control, and his financial situation was in despair. He had tried to return to a bootlegging role, but these organisations needed reliable men who could transport liquor quickly and safely under the guard of night to avoid the police, and George's drinking didn't allow that.
Feeling he was at a dead end, he attempted suicide by ingesting bichloride of mercury. As the chemical entered his system, he picked up the phone and called his father. "I'm committing suicide," he said flatly. "Will you bury me, Dad?" The response was ice cold. "Gladly, son." Miraculously, George survived and was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital. At his bedside, his father delivered one final blow. "George," he said, "why don't you stop botching up every move you make in your life? The next time you try something like this, use a gun and make a clean job of killing yourself." It was a brutal exchange that left deep scars. Once recovered, George left for Kansas City, where he found work as a grocery store checker. He convinced Geneva to give him one last chance, and she moved there with the children. But the reunion didn't last. She soon discovered that George was stealing from the store. Another violent argument erupted, and this time, Geneva packed up the children and returned to Memphis for good. 6 months later, she was granted a divorce. By his mid-20s, George Barnes had torched every bridge: husband, father, employee, and son. The only thing he seemed to excel at was making trouble. But the next chapter of his life wouldn't be written in grocery aisles or college dorms. It would unfold in smoky backrooms, rum-running routes, and the rising shadow of organised crime. The transformation from George Barnes to Machine Gun Kelly was about to begin. After leaving behind the wreck of his first marriage, George Barnes, now calling himself George R. Kelly, resurfaced in Kansas City in 1925.
Agents fight hopelessly against illegal liquor. These homemade stills are but a few of thousands.
With Prohibition still in full swing, he saw opportunity in the liquor trade. He started small, but ambition burned beneath the surface. Soon, Kelly had set up a small bootlegging operation, selling illegal alcohol across Missouri and further. Kansas City was just the beginning. Working with a tight circle of trusted men, Kelly expanded into Texas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Mississippi. He purchased extra trucks, grew his distribution network, and even pushed westward into Santa Fe, New Mexico.
He had quit the drinking habit by this time, and Kelly was surprisingly disciplined in how he ran his bootlegging operation. He only worked with men who had clean reputations, honest men, he called them. He paid them generously, not just for their labour, but also for their loyalty.
For a while, things were smooth. The money was steady, the risk tolerable. Kelly had the charisma to lead and the instinct to grow, but what he didn't have was restraint. Author Myron Quimby painted a vivid portrait of Kelly during this period. George was a large man with a round face and blue eyes, who was always grinning when he wasn't boasting. He wasn't exactly handsome, but women found him attractive, and he had a natural air of good humour about him. His one big failing was his mouth. He could never keep it closed. He was a big blusterer who eventually came to believe his own lies. That mouth would catch up with him, and that mouth would be his downfall. Whilst boasting in a bar, an undercover Prohibition agent was noting down everything Kelly said. On March the 14th, 1927, Kelly was arrested in Santa Fe. Convicted on bootlegging charges, he spent several months in a New Mexico state prison. After his release, he moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, hoping for a fresh start, but trouble followed. On July the 24th, 1927, he was arrested again after he was caught selling liquor on an Indian reservation, which was a federal offence, and this time the consequences were much more severe. At the federal courthouse in Tulsa, George Kelly was sentenced to 3 years in the notorious Leavenworth Penitentiary. It was a turning point, not just a punishment, but an initiation. Kelly was about to enter a new world, one where crime wasn't a hustle, it was a career.
Inside Leavenworth, Kelly crossed paths with men whose names were already echoing through the underworld. Charlie Harmon, Frank Jelly Nash, Francis Jimmy Keating, and Thomas Holden. They were all seasoned bank robbers. Together, they formed connections in the shadows, whispering plans and forging alliances behind prison walls. Keating and Holden worked jobs in the prison's record section, with forged trusty passes made with help from Charlie Harmon and George Kelly, who both worked in the prison's photography department. The two simply walked out of Leavenworth in late February 1930. It truly was one of the most boldest and notorious prison escapes of the decade.
Prison officials would later name Kelly and Harmon as key accomplices in the breakout. Kelly's time in prison would link him to a new type of criminal. These were more dangerous and organised than the local bootleggers that he had known. When George Kelly was finally released from Leavenworth in 1930, he didn't waste time drifting. He headed to Oklahoma City to meet up with his new friends and former prison associates, a city where he would meet the woman who would change his life forever. Behind nearly every legend lies a master of illusion. And in the case of Machine Gun Kelly, that master was a woman named Catherine Brooks. She was born Cleo Brooks in Saltillo, Mississippi in 1904. Her early years were marked not by innocence, but by speed. By the age of 15, she had already married a labourer named Lonnie Fry and soon gave birth to a daughter named Pauline. The marriage was brief and turbulent, and after their split, Cleo started swapping husbands, names and identities like others changed their clothes. She briefly married a man named Ali Brewer, but that too didn't last. Around this time, she started calling herself Catherine, a name that she chose for its more glamorous ring. Cleo was too common, but Catherine had a certain edge. It sounded like someone you didn't want to cross, and in the case of Catherine, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Her mother, Aura Brooks, also reinvented herself after a divorce. She married Robert Shannon, a political operator in Wise County, Texas, known as Boss Shannon. He was a Democratic Party powerhouse in the region with shady connections and even shadier friends. Aura followed suit, establishing herself as a bootlegger during Prohibition. The couple owned a ranch near Paradise in Texas, and it served as a hideout for criminals. For $50 a night, fugitives could stay safe under Aura's care. Catherine, like her mother, took to crime with natural flair. Her third marriage was to Charlie Thorne, another bootlegger. She dove headfirst into the liquor racket, making connections and building her own reputation. But when she discovered that Thorne was cheating on her, her response was swift and lethal.
On April the 30th, 1928, a gas station attendant said that Catherine stopped for fuel on her way home and casually declared to her that "I'm bound for Coleman, Texas to kill that goddamn Charlie Thorne." The very next day, Thorne was found dead from a gunshot wound with a typed suicide note next to him, though it was fairly common knowledge in the area at the time that Charlie Thorne was illiterate. The coroner ruled it a suicide and no charges were ever filed.
Over the next few years, Catherine racked up a rap sheet that rivaled any man's. She was arrested repeatedly for shoplifting in Fort Worth, robbery in Oklahoma City, and even prostitution. She served time for receiving stolen goods, and crime wasn't just a personal choice, it was a family tradition. Her auntie was a prostitute, her cousin a bootlegger. This was the world that Catherine came from, and she was thriving in it. Two of her uncles were locked up in Leavenworth, one for auto theft and the other for counterfeiting. It was during her visits to her uncles in prison that she became acquainted with George, who had befriended her uncles inside. By the late 1920s, Catherine had traded moonshine for manicures, taking up work in a Fort Worth beauty parlour. Her looks were deceptive. To the untrained eye, she was charming, refined, and harmless. But under the surface, she was calculating, streetwise, and fully immersed in the underworld. One local businessman, enchanted by her appearance, asked her out on a date. Years later, after being interviewed by J. Edgar Hoover, he revealed, "Remember that innocent little girl I was going to show a good time? She took me to more speakeasies, more bootleg dives, and more holes in the wall than I ever thought existed in all of Texas. She knows more bums than the police department. She can drink liquor like water, and she's got some of the toughest women friends I ever laid eyes on."
It was Catherine herself that crafted the Machine Gun Kelly persona. She bought George his first ever Tommy gun and insisted that he learned how to use it. And then she got creative. After target practice, she handed out spent shell casings as souvenirs to friends and relatives. In no time, wild stories started to circulate. Rumours started circulating that Machine Gun Kelly was a World War I veteran, that he could sign his name in lead and shoot an acorn off a fence post from 30 metres away. The truth? George Kelly had never served a day in uniform. He'd used a college medical deferment to dodge the draft, and the Thompson submachine gun wasn't even ready to be fielded by the time that World War I ended. Nevertheless, the lies worked, and Machine Gun Kelly's persona was born, manufactured by Catherine, who was pulling the strings behind the scenes.
At the time, George was working as a bootlegger for a man named Little Steve Anderson in Oklahoma City. What began as a working relationship took a sharp turn when George and Catherine fell for each other hard. The only problem, Catherine was Anderson's mistress. They didn't care. The pair fled the city together, stealing Anderson's brand new Cadillac and, as legend has it, even his prized English bulldog. It was a messy, dramatic exit, fitting for a couple destined for infamy. The duo then vanished into the Midwest's criminal underground, finally ending up in Minneapolis. In May 1930, George Barnes, bootlegger, college dropout and ex-husband, married Catherine Brooks, and together they adopted a new identity, George and Catherine Kelly. Together, they would become one of the most notorious crime couples of the 1930s, and together they would write a story soaked in blood, bullets, and myth. On July the 15th, 1930, just months after he fled Oklahoma City with his new wife, Machine Gun Kelly was invited to join a high-stakes crew assembled by his old prison associates, Jelly Nash, Jimmy Keating, and Thomas Holden, as a thank you for helping them escape Leavenworth Penitentiary. Their first target was the Bank of Wilmar in Minnesota, a small-town institution located 100 miles west of St. Paul. The crew was no small-time outfit. It included infamous names like Harvey Bailey, Vern Miller, and Sammy Silverman. The robbery was violent, chaotic, and brazen. The gang made off with $70,000, a fortune for the time, but the heist left blood in its wake. A cashier was pistol-whipped, and when a crowd gathered outside the bank, one of the gunmen opened fire with a Thompson submachine gun, wounding 2 women in the crowd. During their escape, a local man with a rifle fatally shot Sammy Silverman, who died on the scene. The chaos left Minnesota's Bureau of Criminal Activity reeling. One spokesperson for the Bureau said, "I can't remember a hold-up in the history of the state since the raids of the Younger Brothers and Jesse James's gangs, which compares to the one at Wilmar for the daring and cold-blooded disregard of human life." But the fallout wasn't over.
3 of the alleged gunmen from the Wilmar crew, Frank Coleman, Mike Rusick, and Samuel Stein, were later found shot to death at White Bear Lake in Minnesota. The murders were reportedly the result of a dispute with the unstable and volatile Vern Miller, whose reputation for ruthlessness was growing by the day. Vern Miller was under the impression that he had been double-crossed by the trio, who were going to give him up to the police, and took action.
It was his connection to unhinged killers like Miller that Machine Gun Kelly's name soon became a fixture in a string of violent bank robberies across the Midwest. In September 1930, he took part in a heist in Ottumwa, Iowa, alongside a who's who of Depression-era desperados: Holden, Keating, Bailey, Vern Miller, Fred Barker, and Lawrence Duvall. Then, on April the 8th, 1931, Kelly played a supporting role in the Sherman, Texas robbery, where Bailey, Miller, and Nash looted $40,000 from the Central State Bank. The rampant bank robberies continued for a few years. During this time, George and Catherine lived, ironically, at the home of her former husband, Charlie Thorne, at 857 East Mulkey Street in Fort Worth, Texas. By 1932, Kelly had forged a new partnership with Albert Bates, a career criminal with a long tangled rap sheet and a talent for survival. Bates had been in and out of prisons across the West: Carson City, Salt Lake City, Denver, Colorado, and Michigan. At one point, Denver police even suspected him in the murder of two of his own accomplices. No one knows exactly how Kelly and Bates met, but their alliance would shape the most successful period of Kelly's criminal career. In September 1932, Kelly, Bates, and another experienced criminal, Eddie Bentz, journeyed across the country to the small farming town of Colfax, Washington, a town that sits near the eastern edge of the state. On September the 21st, they stormed the First Trust and Savings Bank, escaping with $77,000, Kelly's largest haul to date.
Authorities quickly traced the gang's trail to Fort Worth in Texas, but by the time the police arrived there, the Kellys had already vanished. A few weeks later, Bentz was arrested in a Dallas post office, and during questioning, he admitted to knowing the Kellys and Bates, claiming that they had a hideout on a Texas ranch. But he denied any involvement in the Colfax bank robbery, and when released on bail, Eddie Bentz skipped town.
Then, on November the 30th, 1932, Kelly, Bates, and a Chicago gunman named Eddie Doll robbed the Citizens State Bank of Tupelo, Mississippi, stealing $38,000. But this time, Kelly wasn't carrying his signature Thompson. Instead, he used a .38 caliber revolver, blending into the scene like any other gunman. After the robbery, the bank's head teller remarked, he was the kind of guy that, if you looked at him, you would never think that he was a bank robber. This robbery was first linked to Pretty Boy Floyd. Then a letter came to a local newspaper. It was signed by Kelly himself, claiming responsibility for the crime. This made the front page across the country, and now Kelly wasn't just a criminal anymore. Machine Gun Kelly was a name. He embraced his new image with flair. He adopted the persona of a wealthy gentleman, a man who looked like he belonged behind a bank desk rather than robbing one. He bought tailored suits, handmade English shoes, silk ties, and meticulously groomed his hair and moustache. His habits were precise, his wardrobe immaculate, his image carefully constructed. The picture of himself going into a bank, holding a gun, and knowing that he had power over those he was robbing greatly appealed to Machine Gun Kelly. George Kelly didn't just want to succeed, he wanted to dominate, to surpass the very men who had first ushered him into the world of high-stakes crime. As Kelly's fame grew, he was still overshadowed by figures like John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd. Their Robin Hood images earned them much more public admiration. Kelly decided he needed to go alone to gain the notoriety that others had that he craved, and he did. Kelly would rob banks with his wife beside him in Kansas City, Chicago, Denver, and across Texas and Mississippi. Catherine not only helped plan these robberies, but she often participated in them, even dressing as a man and serving as an armed getaway driver. She'd created the Machine Gun Kelly image, and now she was part of the act. Together, they were dangerous, but more than that, They were deliberate. They weren't just robbing banks, they were building a legend. By early 1933, George and Catherine Kelly were worn out. They were tired of police chases, dodging bullets during bank robberies, and sharing their loot with too many people. They wanted something bigger, something safer, something more lucrative. So they pivoted. Kidnapping, Catherine suggested, and not just any grab and run. It had to be clean, calculated, and high stakes. George might have been the face of the operation, but Catherine was certainly the brains. She had a vision and ambition.
It was Catherine who first floated the idea. Word had it, she told George, that Eddie Doll, an old associate they'd met through Albert Bates, had found kidnapping to be a highly profitable venture. The Kellys reached out to Doll, re-establishing contact, and quickly began laying the groundwork for their new enterprise. The planning took place inside their Fort Worth residence at 857 East Mulkey. In the dining room, curtains were drawn, maps were spread, and names were whispered, and eventually their first target was chosen.
On January the 27th, 1933, Howard Wolverton, a famous banker from South Bend, Indiana, was driving home with his wife. Suddenly, a figure jumped onto the running board of their car. Brandishing a gun, the man forced his way into the vehicle and demanded that they drive out of town. 2 miles later, the car was intercepted. Wolverton was pulled from the vehicle and transferred into a second car that had been tailing them. Mrs. Wolverton was handed a ransom note demanding $50,000 for her husband's safe return. Kelly was driving the car that had been tailing them, and it was Eddie Doll who had jumped on the running board. Doll's life had been moulded by hardship. Orphaned as a child, he grew up on the tough streets of Chicago. He started as a car thief and then moved on to bootlegging, bank robbery, and now kidnapping. The pair drove Wolverton across northern Indiana for 2 days, dragging out the tension in hopes of pressuring the family into paying. But Wolverton, terrified and exhausted, finally convinced them that he couldn't produce the money. On his promise to raise the ransom later, they dumped him on the outskirts of Michigan City, Indiana, and vanished into the winter mist. They waited for a follow-up. Calls were placed, letters were sent, but no money ever came. Wolverton and his family had decided they weren't playing ball. The gang's first venture into kidnapping was a failure. Back in Fort Worth, with heat building from the Colfax bank robbery, the Kellys were already plotting their next abduction. This time, their target was more ambitious, a wealthy oilman's son.
Catherine, ever the social manipulator, threw a party and invited 2 Fort Worth police detectives, J.W. Swinney and Ed Weatherford. She had her eye on them, not as guests, but as potential co-conspirators. She thought they were crooked, they thought the same of her. In reality, Catherine was trying to recruit them into the kidnapping, assuming that their badges came with flexible morals. Meanwhile, the detectives were hoping to flip her into an informant. During a private moment, Catherine made her pitch. If they pulled off the kidnapping in another state and got arrested, could the detectives vouch that the suspects were wanted in Texas for bank robbery? And then you boys come and claim them. Is that a go? Catherine asked sweetly. She was trying to take advantage over the fact that at this time, the FBI didn't have jurisdiction over state lines. The detectives nodded and then went straight to the FBI.
Catherine had told the detectives of their target, and within days, the son was under constant police protection. Watching the swarm of officers hovering around him, the Kellys quickly scrapped the plan. They weren't stupid. Not yet. While George and Catherine planned their next steps, Two unrelated events shook the criminal underworld. Soon, both would be mistakenly linked to the machine gun Kelly legend. The first incident happened in Kansas. Kelly's old associate, Harvey Bailey, was in Lansing State Penitentiary at the time, and he made headlines. On May the 30th, 1933, Bailey and 10 others, including Wilbur Underhill, staged a dramatic escape. Armed with weapons smuggled in by none other than Frank "Jelly" Nash, the escapees took the warden and 2 guards hostage, then made their way to freedom. The hostages were later released unharmed. The gang retreated to the Cookson Hills of eastern Oklahoma, where they resumed robbing banks. The second event would spark a nationwide manhunt and ultimately reshape the future of federal law enforcement. On June the 17th, 1933, a transfer was taken place in Kansas City. Jelly Nash, captured in Hot Springs, was being escorted by a squad of federal agents and local lawmen to a waiting train at Union Station, but they never made it. As the officers approached their car, gunfire erupted. 3 lawmen, 1 FBI agent, and Jelly Nash himself were gunned down in a hail of bullets. The public was horrified. The event would become known as the Kansas City Massacre. The shooters were never definitively identified, but early rumours swirled. While the FBI would later incorrectly name Pretty Boy Floyd and Adam Ricchetti, the first names to surface were Machine Gun Kelly and Harvey Bailey. It didn't matter that Kelly wasn't even in the city at the time. The legend had outpaced the man. By the summer of 1933, George and Catherine Kelly were growing bolder. Their failed attempts and narrow escapes had taught them one thing: if they wanted real money and a real legacy, kidnapping was the way to achieve that. They reconnected with their old partner, Albert Bates, and this time they chose a target who could bring them the fame and the fortune that they desired. On the night of July the 22nd, 1933, shortly after 11 p.m, Machine Gun Kelly and Albert Bates crept onto the front porch of a stately Oklahoma City mansion located at 327 Northwest 18th Street. Inside, oil tycoon Charles F. Urschel sat playing bridge with his wife and friends. As Catherine waited nearby, Kelly stepped forward into the light, his Tommy gun raised. Mrs. Urschel looked up and screamed. "Stop that," Kelly barked. "Keep quiet or we'll blow your heads off. Which one of you is Urschel?"
Don't move or we'll blow your heads off. We want Urschel. Which one is Urschel? Which one is Urschel? Well then, we'll take them both.
Bates herded both men into a car parked outside, figuring they could sort it out later. A few miles outside the city, a quick check of their wallets revealed the real Urschel. The other man, Walter Jarrett, a friend, was stripped of $51 and dumped on the roadside. The Urschels had only recently married, but their story was already tangled with oil wealth. Charles's first wife had been the sister of Thomas Slick, known as the king of the wildcatters, someone who drilled for and found oil in places where it wasn't previously known to have existed. And now Charles's new bride was Thomas Slick's widow, Bernice, and she had inherited a hell of a lot of that wealth. As soon as the kidnappers fled, Mrs. Urschel and Mrs. Jarrett called the police. They were instructed to immediately contact J. Edgar Hoover in Washington, D.C. Within the hour, federal agents, local police and reporters were swarming all over the Urschel home. By Monday morning, newspapers across the country carried the same headline: Oil King Kidnapped. Urschel was a personal friend of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and that meant one thing to J. Edgar Hoover: this case had to be solved, and fast. The day after the kidnapping, Kelly Bates and their captive arrived at the 500-acre Shannon Ranch in Paradise, Texas, owned by Catherine's mother and stepfather, Aura, and boss, Shannon. Urschel was blindfolded and stashed in the garage until dark, then led outside and chained to an iron bed. Cotton was stuffed into his ears and his mouth was taped shut. The next morning, the kidnappers read him the newspaper headlines over breakfast. That evening, Urschel was moved to a small shack on the property where Armand Shannon, Aura's son, lived with his young wife. Urschel was handcuffed to a baby's high chair, sleeping on a quilt on the floor. Meanwhile, Catherine Kelly was back in Fort Worth, busy building an alibi. She told a detective friend that she had just returned from St. Louis, but when he noticed red Oklahoma dirt on her tires and local newspapers in the back seat, he grew suspicious and contacted the FBI. Soon after, Mrs. Urschel identified George Kelly as the kidnapper from a mugshot. Charles Urschel would remain a prisoner for 9 days, but he wasn't passive, he was actually rather observant. Every time a plane flew overhead, he'd count to 5 and then ask the time. He heard 2 flyovers daily, one at 9:45 a.m. and 5:45 p.m. He noted the mineral taste of the water, the clanking of the pump, the frequency of rainfall, and even left fingerprints around the property. All of it, sound, smell, time, he memorized to a T. He also listened carefully to the men guarding him. At one point, Bates sneered at the legend of Bonnie and Clyde. They're just a couple of cheap filling station and car thieves. I've been stealing for 25 years and my group doesn't deal in anything cheap. I wouldn't hesitate to rob the Security National Bank. Kelly was more talkative and more arrogant. He told Urschel, "This place is as safe as it can be. All of the boys use it. After they pull a bank job or something, they come down here to cool off." The ransom demand was crafted with care. Kelly told Urschel that there were too many agents in Oklahoma City. It wasn't safe to reach out to his family directly. Urschel suggested a friend in Tulsa, E.E. Kirkpatrick, and was given paper to write 2 letters, one to Kirkpatrick and the other to his wife, Mrs. Urschel. The next morning, a messenger delivered 2 letters, one to Kirkpatrick and one to Mrs. Urschel. Kirkpatrick was not only a family friend, but he was also an oilman and a newspaper publisher. The demand he received on his desk that morning was $200,000 in used Federal Reserve currency. The instructions: place a classified ad in the Daily Oklahoman that read, "For sale, 160 acres of land, good 5-room house, deep well, also cows, tools, tractors, corn and hay, $3,700 for quick sales, terms." 2 days after posting the advert, an airmail letter postmarked Joplin, Missouri arrived at the Daily Oklahoman. It told Kirkpatrick to board the Sooner train to Kansas City on the night of July the 22nd, watch the right side of the track and throw the money out of the train window when he saw 2 bonfires. The second fire would mark the drop point and Urschel would be there, it said. Kirkpatrick approached the police and all the serial numbers on the money were recorded at the First National Bank of Oklahoma City, but the plan fell apart. Kelly reportedly couldn't reach the drop point in time due to car trouble, and the bonfires were never lit. Fortunately, Machine Gun Kelly had a plan B. Kirkpatrick was told to check into the Muellerback Hotel in Kansas City under the name Edgar Kincaid. Once there, a telegram arrived. "Unavoidable incident kept me from seeing you last night. Will communicate about 6 p.m. Signed, E.W. Moore. At 5:45 p.m. on Sunday, July the 30th, the hotel phone rang. Kirkpatrick was instructed to take a cab to the LaSalle Hotel and walk west along Linwood Boulevard, carrying the suitcase containing the cash in his right hand. He asked if he could bring a friend along. "Hell no," the voice snapped. "We know all about your friends. You come alone and unarmed." Kirkpatrick, of course, brought a gun anyway. He exited the cab and began walking. A man appeared, stocky, 6 feet tall, dressed in a stylish summer suit, two-toned shoes, and a turned-down Panama hat. He kept walking, then stopped a few feet away. "I'll take that grip," the man said. "But how do I know you're the right party?" Kirkpatrick asked. "Hell, you know damned well I am." Kirkpatrick set the briefcase down slowly. $200,000 is a lot of money. "I need to know that Urschel's okay," Kirkpatrick said. "The boys are waiting. He'll be home in 12 hours. Kirkpatrick memorized every detail of the man, his hair, his skin, his voice, then turned and walked away. Police confirmed that the man in question was George "Machine Gun" Kelly. The next day, on July the 31st, Kelly and Bates returned to the Shannon Ranch, $200,000 richer. They gave Harvey Bailey a $500 cut to settle an old debt. Bailey was holed up at the ranch, recovering from a gunshot wound after his recent breakout from prison. But no one was sure what to do next. There was a serious discussion about whether to kill Urschel, and in the end, the trio decided to release him alive. Too many eyes were on the case, and the FBI would seriously ramp up their efforts to find the trio if Urschel was killed. Bates fetched Urschel from the shack, cleaned him up, and shaved his beard. He was warned not to talk. 20 miles outside Oklahoma City, they handed him $10 and dropped him in the drizzling rain, pointing him towards a gas station. Kelly watched as Urschel staggered away and thought that that was the end of it, but it wasn't. At 9 p.m. that night, Charles Urschel walked back through the front door of his home, and an hour later, the FBI was at his side, and the most intense manhunt in J. Edgar Hoover's Young Bureau would begin. Machine Gun Kelly's legend, so carefully crafted, was about to unravel. The Kellys and Albert Bates fled Texas, heading north to Minneapolis with their $200,000 ransom money. They began quietly circulating the marked bills, but it didn't take long for the walls to close in. The very thing that made their crime so lucrative, the traceable currency, would now light a trail straight to them.
The G-men made a searching study of this elaborate kidnap message. It gave a list of the size of the bills to be paid in the ransom money, $200,000.
Gathering word that the ransom money was traceable, the trio made a decision to split up. On August the 5th, George and Catherine left town. That same day, FBI agents, alerted to a surge of $20 bills matching the ransom serial numbers in the Twin Cities, made their first major arrests in the case. Amongst them was Isidore "Kid Can" Blumenfeld, a local crime boss, along with Sam Kronick, Sam Cosberg, Edward Barney Berman, and Clifford Skelly, all connected to the St. Paul underworld. Back in Texas, the chaos only deepened. On August the 9th, while the FBI tightened its grip on the case, Harvey Bailey, Wilbur Underhill, and others robbed the People's National Bank in Kingfisher, Oklahoma. Bailey, still recovering from a gunshot wound, had used one of Catherine Kelly's Tommy guns for the job. Afterwards, he returned to the Shannon Ranch, the same place where Urschel had been held, to lay low. But the FBI had something stronger than leads. They had Charles Urschel's memory. Thanks to the oilman's sharp observations, the mineral taste in the water, the timing of passing planes, the sound of the squeaky pump, agents were able to pinpoint the Shannon Ranch. On August the 10th, Special Agent Edward Dowd posed as an inspector and visited the property. He casually stopped by Armand Shannon's home, asked for a drink of water, and recognized the distinctive taste immediately. Every detail matched Urschel's recollection. 2 days later, on August the 12th, a multi-agency raiding party descended on the ranch. Led by the FBI and joined by police from Dallas and Fort Worth, including Detectives Swinney and Weatherford. They moved in with Charles Urschel himself in tow. At the ranch, they arrested Bailey along with Aura and boss Shannon. Then they raided Armin's home, arresting Armin and his wife, Aletha. Bailey, armed and sleeping on the porch, was taken into custody with ransom money still in his possession. His capture made the headlines. Kansas City massacre chief has been caught.
But behind the scenes, there was even more intrigue. Alvin Karpis, another bank robber blazing through the Midwest, claimed that Swinney and Weatherford, the same detectives that Catherine tried to recruit, had been cut out of the ransom money and decided to blow the whistle out of spite. That same day, halfway across the country, Albert Bates was arrested at a hotel in Denver. A man had attempted to cash stolen money orders linked to the Tupelo bank robbery. When questioned, he revealed that he bought them from another man named George L. Davis, which was Bates's alias.
The police picked up Bates and discovered over $600 in marked ransom money on him. He tried to have the money forwarded to his attorney, desperate to get it out of evidence, but it was too late. Detectives brought in 4 witnesses from past unsolved robberies. All 4 positively identified Bates as the lone gunman in a 1920 Colorado bank job. To their surprise, Bates admitted it immediately. The Kellys, meanwhile, were losing control.
How should I handle this?
You asking me?
They'd left Minneapolis believing that they were still under the radar, but as arrests mounted, the net was tightening around them fast. In Des Moines, Catherine panicked. On August the 18th, she sent a chilling letter to Assistant Attorney General Joseph B. Keenan. The entire Urschel family and friends and all of you will be exterminated soon. I will gladly put George Kelly on the spot for you if you will save my mother. If you do not comply, I shall commit some minor offence and be placed in jail so that you will know I have no connection with the terrible slaughter that will take place in Oklahoma within the next few days. Catherine never received a reply, and then the events on Labor Day, September the 4th, 1933, tightened the net even more. Harvey Bailey, infamous for escaping prison, did it again. From the supposedly escape-proof Dallas County Jail, he bribed a jailer, received a smuggled gun and hacksaws, and sawed through his prison cell bars. He was caught that very day in Ardmore, Oklahoma. The jailer and the man who supplied the saws were also imprisoned. Bailey suggested that he'd give the Kellys up for a lenient sentence. That same day, far from the headlines, a Depression-era couple, Luther and his wife Mrs. Arnold, along with their 12-year-old daughter Geraldine, were hitchhiking near Hillsborough, Texas. A woman in a red wig stopped to pick them up. It was Catherine Kelly. She took them to Claiborne, paid for food and lodging, and then offered clothes and cash. Before long, she made a confession. "I'm Catherine Kelly," she said, "and I need your help."
She gave Luther $50 and a mission, travel to Fort Worth, Texas, and find out why Keenan hadn't taken her offer of George Kelly's capture for her mother's freedom.
The Arnolds agreed. Luther went to Oklahoma City but failed to speak with Keenan. He monitored the trail of the Shannons and received a telegram to pick up a letter at the post office.
Inside was a San Antonio address where Luther was to reunite with his family and Catherine.
When he arrived, Catherine was there, but the Kellys were not done with the Arnolds just yet. Catherine asked to borrow Geraldine, their daughter, to pose as their own child, a cover for travel.
Come on, honey. Come on.
The Kellys, now accompanied by the girl, headed for Chicago. En route, they made a stop at Cass Coleman's farm outside Coleman, Texas, Catherine's uncle. There, they buried $73,000 of the ransom money. On September the 19th, Charles Urschel received a letter signed by George Kelly himself. If the Shannons are convicted, you can get another rich wife in hell, because that will be the only place you can use one. Adios, smart one, your worst enemy, George Kelly. Handing it in to the FBI, they proved its authenticity with Kelly's fingerprints at the bottom of the letter. Eventually they arrived at their destination, but not even the corrupt city of Chicago offered them refuge. There, Joe Burgle, an underworld fixer and mechanic who supplied cars for Al Capone, gave the couple $200, some whiskey, and a car, with one condition: leave the city. The next day, the Barker Carpis gang robbed a Federal Reserve Bank courier in Chicago, using a bulletproof Hudson tricked out with smokescreens and oil slicks. A police officer was killed and the car was traced to Burgle. Immediately, the FBI suspected Machine Gun Kelly and Vern Miller, who were both rumoured to be in town. Authorities believed the two were trying to raise funds to break Bailey out of jail. The Kellys fled again, this time to Memphis, taking Geraldine with them. While celebrating their third wedding anniversary, Kelly reached out to Cass Coleman, asking him to dig up the ransom money, but Coleman refused. The FBI was watching the property and Coleman sent a coded telegram. The deal fell through. Kelly also sent a wire to the Arnolds in Oklahoma City, unaware that they were already in FBI custody and talking. The telegram read, "We'll send Geraldine back to Oklahoma City by train tonight." When Geraldine arrived back by train, FBI agents were waiting and she told them everything. Machine Gun Kelly and his wife were running out of places to hide. In the early morning hours of September the 26th, 1933, the law finally caught up with the legend.
Machine Gun Kelly, desperado extraordinary, in custody at last. Called the mastermind in the kidnapping of Charles Urschel, oil millionaire. Kelly's wife, Catherine, arrested with him, is going too.
Acting on information provided by 12-year-old Geraldine Arnold, Memphis police and federal agents surrounded 1408 Rayner Street, the Kellys' hideout. Armed with Tommy guns, automatics and shotguns, they burst in. Inside, George Kelly, barefoot and in his pajamas, stepped out of the bathroom. When he saw the rifles aimed his way, George Kelly dropped his gun, slowly raised his hands, and uttered the words that would define his myth forever. "Don't shoot, G-men, don't shoot." With one headline, Machine Gun Kelly became the ultimate symbol of the Bureau's success. Kelly and Catherine were arraigned later that day in Shelby County Jail, both pleading not guilty to the kidnapping of Charles Urschel. Kelly was cocky. "I'll be out of this in no time," he boasted. "Let's see them keep me." When he read the formal charges, he snapped, "I won't sign that." "You don't have to," an officer replied. "That's just the charge against you." Once again, showing his intelligence. Catherine, however, wasn't nearly as defiant. She agreed to waive extradition and go quietly to Oklahoma City. Her story was carefully calculated. Her family had been coerced into helping George. The Shannons, she claimed, had only watched over Urschel because they were afraid. "I'm glad we were both arrested," she told the Memphis police chief, "because I am not guilty, and I can prove it. I'll be rid of him and that bunch. I don't want to say anything about that guy Kelly, but he got me into this terrible mess, and I don't want to have anything more to do with him." In the days that followed, newspapers continued to link Kelly to the Kansas City massacre, the Chicago Federal Reserve robbery, and a St. Paul police shooting. Chicago's chief of detectives, William Shoemaker, formally requested that Kelly be brought to Chicago to face charges before Oklahoma. Hearing this news, the next day, Kelly had a change of heart. "You've got me right on the Urschel kidnapping," he admitted to FBI agent W.A. Rohrer, "but not the Chicago robbery or the Kansas City Union Station job." He waived extradition. On September the 27th, FBI agents raided Cass Coleman's farm and unearthed $73,250 of the ransom money. Coleman was also arrested. Meanwhile, the first wave of trials against the Shannons, Bates, Bailey and the St. Paul Moneymen was nearing its end. These would be the first federal trials held under the Lindbergh Law, enacted after the 1932 murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr., granting the FBI jurisdiction over kidnappings involving interstate movements. District Attorney Herbert K. Hyde, in his closing statement, thundered, "I beg of you, in the name of my government, to return a verdict of guilty. Precedents are being set here that will guide the courts and the bar in all future trials that grow out of this determined effort to stamp out this most damnable of crimes, kidnapping." It took the jury less than 2 hours to deliver a verdict. On September the 30th, 7 defendants were found guilty, whilst Kidcan, Cronick and Cosberg were acquitted. Sentencing was scheduled for the following week. On October the 1st, the Kellys were flown to Oklahoma City amid a convoy of 9 aeroplanes. Stepping off the plane, Kelly grinned at the photographers and said, "Hello gang, nice trip." The guards were not taking chances. One held a machine gun to Kelly, another watched the crowd. At the airport, Charles and Bernice Urschel stood waiting. "That's the man," Charles said. "That face will haunt me for as long as I live," his wife Bernice added. The Kellys were rushed to jail in a 10-car motorcade. Their trial would begin on October the 9th. 2 days before sentencing, Kelly and Catherine shocked the press. Despite rumours they'd plead guilty, they instead entered pleas of not guilty. Judge Edward Vaught sentenced Bates, Bailey, Boss Shannon and Aura Shannon to life in prison.
Therefore, the judgment of this court that Albert L. Bates be sentenced to the federal penitentiary for the term of his natural life. It's the judgment of this court that Harvey J. Bailey be sentenced to the federal penitentiary for the term of his natural life. It's the judgment of this court that R.G. Shannon be sentenced to the federal penitentiary for the term of his natural life. Judgment of this court that Aura L. Shannon be sentenced to the federal penitentiary for the term of her natural life.
As Boss and Aura Shannon stood stunned, Catherine glared at the judge and then broke down. Kelly passed Urschel on his way out and muttered, "You'll get yours, you bastard." Then he drew a finger across his throat. Urschel didn't flinch, he'd already won. The trial of the Kellys began on October the 9th, a national media event. It marked the first time sound equipment was allowed in a federal courtroom. Whilst Kelly appeared gaunt and uneasy, Catherine, dressed in stylish clothes, smiled for the cameras. That first morning, she spotted her father near the elevator. As she moved in for a kiss, Agent J.C. White gave her a slight shove. She turned and slapped him. Machine Gun Kelly, behind her in handcuffs, lunged to defend her, only to be pistol whipped by White. Catherine screamed, "Don't, don't." Minutes later, she was casually chatting with the agent. Bruised and bleeding, Kelly sat through the trial with a swollen temple and a gash on his head. The night before, he'd refused his dinner, smashed his food tray and gone to bed hungry. In just one day, a jury was selected and half the government's witnesses testified. The evidence was overwhelming. Mr. and Mrs. Urschel, amongst others, gave damning accounts. Catherine started crying when her wheelchair-bound grandmother was wheeled out in front of the court to testify against her. On day 2, the attention turned to Catherine's role in the kidnapping. Mrs. Arnold, Geraldine's mother, testified that Catherine had confessed to her. Mrs. Kelly said they ought to have killed the son of a bitch, Urschel. She wished she could do it herself. She also revealed that Catherine had taken 12-year-old Geraldine without her permission. "I let her have my baby for a little ride," she said. "It was 2 weeks before I saw her again."
When Geraldine took to the stand herself, she detailed the strange and quite terrifying journey that she had with the Kellys, saying that Machine Gun Kelly himself made repeated threats against George Vaught, Charles Urschel, and the prosecutors. The jury sat silent as she spoke.
Handwriting expert tells us, if you write, you are caught.
A handwriting expert confirmed that the threatening letter to Urschel was penned by Catherine. Cass Coleman, her uncle, testified that the couple argued over hiding the ransom, with Catherine calling her husband that damned fool. On October the 11th, Catherine took the stand in her own defence. She denied it all: the kidnapping, the threats, even being at the farm when the ransom money was buried. She painted herself as a frightened woman married to a madman. I begged him to release the man, she said. He told me it was none of my business. He said they were going to kill him. I told him, if you do, I'll tell, even if you kill me. When Keenan asked why she hadn't surrendered, but I didn't know I was wanted, she replied. Kelly sat stone-faced. His own wife and his lawyers were building their defence by throwing him under the bus. Judge Vaught, in his final statement, made a rare move. He addressed the jury directly about Catherine. Catherine Kelly's testimony, he said, did not sound convincing. Her conduct at the Coleman farm convinces this court that she had full criminal knowledge of the abduction. Less than an hour before deliberations began, the verdict came in.
It's the judgment of the court that George R. Kelly be sentenced to the federal penitentiary for the term of his natural life.
George and Catherine Kelly were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Catherine was furious. Anyone would have been convicted in this court, she screamed. If they brought my dog in here, he'd have gotten a life sentence too. She transferred her home to her 14-year-old daughter, Pauline Fry, along with her jewellery. Before saying goodbye, she turned to George and told him to be a good boy. Kelly promised he'd break out of Leavenworth by Christmas. He always does what he says he'll do, Catherine told reporters. Shackled hand and foot, George was led to a train. Don't worry about me going stir crazy, he muttered. I won't be in there long. Some guards joked that Kelly was headed for a new penitentiary located on Alcatraz Island, a place reserved for the worst of the worst. How does that sound to you? One of the guards asked him. Kelly shrugged. Listen, McNeil Island's just as tough, he replied, and don't forget, they always get away from there as well. However, he wouldn't always be so confident. George Machine Gun Kelly spent just over a year at Leavenworth Penitentiary before his name was added to the transfer list for a new kind of prison, one that would become legendary. In October 1934, Kelly, along with fellow kidnappers Albert Bates and Harvey Bailey, was shipped west to Alcatraz, the government's fortress of last resort. There, perched on a rocky island in San Francisco Bay, Kelly joined a roster of hardened men he already knew. Tommy Holden, Jimmy Keating, Eddie Doll, Eddie Bentz, Alvin Karpis, Doc Barker, and the most famous of them all, Al Capone. Kelly, once the flashiest of outlaws, became something else entirely, a model inmate. He took a job in the prison laundry, attended Bible study, and even began writing remorseful letters to Charles Urschel himself, begging for forgiveness and asking Urschel to intercede on his behalf. Urschel, who had endured death threats and feared for his family's safety, never replied. His change of character earned him the nickname in Alcatraz as Pop Gun Kelly, as he liked to tell big stories, but was evidently not the type of man who'd carry them out. Albert Bates, like Kelly, wrote to Urschel seeking forgiveness. But he too received no reply,
Albert Bates died behind the walls of Alcatraz on July the 4th, 1948, becoming the first of the convicted kidnappers to pass away. Others who circled the Kellys' orbit fared no better.
Harvey Bailey, who had never even participated in the Urschel kidnapping, was paroled in 1961, but Kansas authorities were not finished with him. He was rearrested and sent back to prison for a 1933 bank robbery, finally walking free in 1965. In his later years, he lived quietly in Joplin, Missouri, working as a cabinet maker and even helping co-write a book about his life. He died in 1979 at the age of 91. However, some fates were far darker. Wilbur Underhill, Bailey's former partner, was fatally gunned down during a honeymoon hideout in Shawnee, Oklahoma in December 1933, just 5 months after the Urschel kidnapping. He died in a hail of bullets along with an innocent woman. Tommy Holden, released from Alcatraz in 1948, returned to Chicago and spiraled out of control. During a drunken argument, he murdered his wife and 2 of her brothers. Placed on the FBI's most wanted list, he was captured in Oregon in 1951 and sentenced to 25 years. He died of a heart attack in 1953. Jimmy Keating, Holden's old partner, took a different path. He thrived inside prison, earning praise at both Leavenworth and Alcatraz, though he was once written up for laughing too loudly in the mess hall and sneaking an extra bowl of ice cream. Released in 1948, Keating moved to Minneapolis, worked in a florist shop, and then became a successful union organizer. He remarried, became a grandfather, and died peacefully in 1978 at the age of 79. Catherine Kelly, ever the enigma, served her sentence in several institutions, including Cincinnati, Alderson, and Milan, Michigan. In Milan, she wrote poetry, contributed to the prison newspaper, and rose to the rank of assistant editor. She lobbied for release, claiming she had been wrongfully convicted based on flawed handwriting analysis, and she may have been right. The handwriting expert who testified against her wasn't from the FBI, but privately hired by the Oklahoma prosecutor. A memo in FBI files, dated September the 22nd, 1933, a month before they were found guilty, stated that Catherine had not written the ransom note or threatening letter. This evidence was withheld, and Catherine was never allowed to call her own expert. Former FBI agent William Turner revealed the truth in his book, Hoover's FBI, The Men and the Myth. Under mounting pressure, the courts granted Catherine a new trial. When the FBI refused to release its files, the case collapsed, and Catherine was set free in 1958 on a $10,000 bond. She settled in Oklahoma City, living in a small abode with a mother. She changed her name to Lyra Cleo Kelly and worked as a bookkeeper at the Oklahoma County Poor Farm, which was at the time a hospital and nursing home. Her mother Aura died in 1980, aged 92, and was followed by Catherine in 1985, who died at the age of 81. As for the man of the moment, George Kelly was transferred back to Leavenworth in 1951 and assigned to the furniture factory. The once infamous outlaw, now balding and greying, was largely forgotten. On July the 17th, 1954, 1 day shy of his 54th birthday, Machine Gun Kelly died of a massive heart attack. The New York Herald Tribune ran a brief obituary headlined, "Machine Gun Kelly dies. Kidnapper coined the term G-Men." In one of his final letters to Charles Urschel, George Kelly wrote, "These 5 words seem written in fire on the walls of my cell. Nothing can be worth this."
A fitting epitaph for a man who once carved his name into the headline with bullets and ended his days quietly folding laundry in a fortress he could never escape from. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, please do like the video and subscribe. And if you really enjoyed it, then please consider becoming a channel member, where you'll receive weekly content, access to our private Discord, monthly live streams, and much, much more. So if that sounds of interest to you, then for $5 a month, you can join our community. If not, that's absolutely fine. Thanks again so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.